Hello, everybody, and welcome to our analysis of clinical incidents workshop. Um, we've got a lot of people that have come today, and we've noticed that we've got a particularly international audience, which is really great for us. But it also means that some of you might not know what the Q community is. So we'll give you a little, very brief explanation of that. But my name's Darren Wright, and I lead on strategy and business development for Q. Before I do introduce our speakers today, Charles and Helen, there's a few things around how we run the workshops which I think would be really important to set out for you. For those of you who don't know, the Q community is a community that spans across the UK and Ireland. We have 6,000 members. We primarily focus on collaborating around quality improvement and patient safety. We've been working for 10 years now. If you are not a member, then it would be really good if you came to join us. Charles, could I ask you to move the slide on one, please? Excellent. As you can see there, there's a QR code. So if you whip your phone out and take a photo of that or highlight it, you'll be taken through to our Join Q page, and that will give you a bit more information about the community, but it'll also give you some information about how you come and join Q. We're really always looking forward to new members, so please have a look at that and come and join us. If you do have questions, ask them in the chat on the side there. There are closed captions that are available. I just need to check how you do this on Zoom. But if you'd like to see them displayed, then click on the bottom at the bottom of the screen under More, where you'll see CC, and then they'll be displayed for you. As you will have noticed when you came in, we are recording this session, but what we will not do is record the question and answers at the end. We just want to record the main content of the session. We will be sharing post-workshop all of the slides and all of the detail that's within this, so you don't need to ask for that. It will definitely come to you. And there's also going to be some sort of supplementary links that support the content as well, which will go out to you after the workshop. Now, I'd just like to introduce both Helen and Charles to you. Helen Higham is an Associate Professor at the University of Oxford and a Consultant Anaesthetist at Oxford University Hospital NHS Foundation Trust. She's the Director of OxStar, focusing on simulation and patient safety research. Helen has led NHS safety investigations and developed national training programmes. She is also a founding member of the Association for Simulated Practice in Healthcare and contributes to various committees on patient safety. Charles is Professor of Psychology and Emeritus Fellow at the University of Oxford and an Emeritus Professor of Clinical Safety Research at Imperial College London. He has a focus on patient safety in healthcare. He trained as a clinical psychologist and has researched the causes and consequences of patient harm since 1985. He founded the Clinical Risk Unit at the University College London and later worked at Imperial College, where he directed the National Institute of Health Research Centre for Patient Safety. And I don't think we could have found two better qualified people to talk about the incidents of clinical safety.
So welcome to the webinar, and thank you all for joining us and to talk about this topic, which has been a concern of Helen and I for many, many years. We've worked a lot on this issue. So the plan is that I will give you some background to the whole idea of the London Protocol and some of the thinking behind it. And then for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then Helen will follow on and explain the importance of this work in her clinical practice and in her work on safety generally, and offer some of her own reflections about the practicalities of how to go about things. So to begin with, I want to go back and explain to you the thinking behind this, because so many NHS documents and documents in many countries, you get a kind of manual for something, but it's not clear where it came from, what the thinking was behind it. And to me, this is very important because what I think gives the London Protocol its simplicity and coherence is the fact it was based on some very fundamental ideas which have been very influential in safety in many industries. So this is James Reason, who many of you will know of. This is his 1990 book, Human Error, which is very famous in many, as I say, in many industries. Jim died recently and was a huge influence on me, personal support, and his writing is really extraordinary. Nowadays, I sometimes hear from people that think the idea of a system, or that we shouldn't blame people in safety, is a relatively recent idea. This is absolutely false. Next slide, Helen. So I recently wrote a tribute to Jim, which will be published in Applied Ergonomics, and I used part of this, and I want to just read you this. Several recent accidents in complex high-risk technologies had their primary origins in a variety of delayed action human failures. And then he talks about the disasters being due to the adverse conjunction of a large number of factors, each one necessary but singly inefficient. So already straight away, you have the idea of complexity, complex systems, multiple factors. Then in the next paragraph, he goes on to say, although the errors of the people at the human system interface, this is sort of pilots or people working in the oil industry or healthcare, whatever, feature large in the immediate post-accident investigation. That means we immediately go to the nurse or doctor who made a mistake. He says these frontline people are rarely the principal problems in a system breakdown. And he goes on to say that they just provide those local triggering conditions to manifest system weaknesses. So he moves, if you like, the causes of accidents from the people at the front line into the wider system. It's not that we as individuals don't have an influence. Of course, what we do, how we behave, are important. But he shifts it into a much wider system thinking. And I remember hearing about this when I first heard him talk, and it was absolute revelation to me and many other people. And you'll see that this comes from 1989. So Jim talked to us about active failures and latent conditions. And this is what the sort of fundamental ideas behind the London Protocol. And the active failures are the unsafe acts, the errors and violations. These are things that people do or don't do. If you're a nurse and you miss out one of the medications, or you provide the wrong medication or something like that, that kind of thing is the active failures. The latent conditions are, as he says, sort of decisions about staffing, equipment, the way the place is designed, all sorts of other things that are there in the system, and as a result of decisions made by other people. We might express it slightly differently now, but this is the essential idea, to separate two things, the kind of behavioral errors of individuals from the wider system. Next slide, Helen. And this slide gives us the organizational accident model. So on the right-hand side, you have the accident, the incident in healthcare, the plane crash, the runway accident, or whatever it might be. And behind that, we won't perhaps talk about defenses at the moment. As Jim says, there's the immediate errors or problems, violations of procedures sometimes that are the immediate causes of the accident, you might say. But behind that, these other conditions, these latent conditions, he says, we need, more importantly, to look at the error-producing conditions. What are the circumstances which led to somebody making this mistake? The fatigue, the tiredness, the poor staffing, the way the teams worked, all these things. And behind that, various decisions and organizational processes. That's the thinking. That starts to open out the causes of problems. And we renamed some of these factors. Instead of errors and violations, we use the term care management problems, because when we first started working on this in maternity, for instance, we would see problems of a mother not being monitored for 2 hours or 4 hours, or nobody going to check on the vital signs in a patient. So the term error didn't seem quite right. So we looked, and not applicable in healthcare in quite the same way. So we used a more general term and more neutral term of care management problems. And instead of latent conditions, we started to talk about contributory factors, meaning essentially the same thing. What aspects of the system make life difficult. And here, this is a paper in the British Medical Journal. This was derived from our work when we began to work with Sally Adams, Nicola Stanhope, went out into maternity units, particularly in other areas, and started to collect stories of incidents and accidents. This was before we had methods of investigation, and even before we had, long before we had patient safety. And from this, we started to say, well, what are, in healthcare, what are these factors, these latent conditions? What are these contributory factors? They're obviously a bit different from the lists I'd seen in aviation, nuclear, and so on. And we divided it into 7 categories, 7 levels of safety. Things about the patient: they might be angry, they might be distressed, they're cognitively, they might be very quite challenged. These are all things that might influence the problems occurring in care. The task, is there a protocol? Is it clear? What's the guidance for staff? Then your staff attitudes, values, behavior, skills, all these sort of things, the way a team works, the working conditions. Sometimes things like there's poor lighting, often healthcare environments are extremely noisy, you can't hear people, the poor equipment design, and so on. And then the wider organizational and regulatory things. So these are the systems. And from these ideas, we then took all this, and the next slide, Helen, and turned it into a method of actually analyzing the incidents that trouble us all, the accidents, the disasters that we see in healthcare all the time. And first, this was called the alarm protocol. This was the first edition of it, if you might say, published again in the British Medical Journal, and used quite a lot in France, for instance, still the alarm protocol. And then later, we carried out some more studies and investigations in primary care and mental health, and we produced the London protocol, which was a slightly extended version of the original. And this was written by Sally Adams and myself, and it was called the London protocol because we had an awful lot of people involved. Always, and I think, again, this is partly why it's worked well. It's many people contributed, and the alarm protocol was developed with a team of researchers and risk managers, nurses and doctors, all worked together to produce it using incidents on the ground. They would go out and test our version of our protocol and then come back and say, this works, this doesn't, and so on. So it was a very collaborative enterprise. And that's how it's got its name. Next slide, Helen. And when I talk about a protocol, I mean, I don't mean something rigid and formulaic. I think of it as a structured way of thinking, a guide as to how to go through an incident. And I'm sure Helen will reflect more on this when she comes, when she talks in a minute. And you can jump it forward again, Helen. And when you do this, you get to the understanding of incidents as a chain of events, and you see the complexity and the contributory factors and the importance of errors and minor deviations. And you get a much richer picture of these events, which, immediately takes you away from thinking it's all one person's fault and something. So I just want to come, before I go on to the more recent developments, and take you quickly through the London Protocol, the latest aspects. I just want to touch on what the purpose of incident analysis is, because I think this is often misunderstood. And particularly because people say, well, it's just a, looking retrospective look at things, and we should be doing much more proactive, clever techniques which look to the future, as if this was possible. But when you think about it, it's not, for one thing, as you can see already, it's not a search for root causes, one or several. The whole picture is much more fluid and complex than that. And personally, I very much dislike the term root cause analysis. It's very misleading. But the real point of it is, in a sense, although the incident and the explanation of the incident matter very much for the people involved, for the families, the patients, and indeed the staff, that's very important. But for system learning, in a way, it doesn't matter what has happened in the past. What you really want to look at is what the incident is telling you about your system now. And that's why, in a sense, it can be used as a very pragmatic method. And that's why we call it a systems analysis and a window on the system, which is a phrase that comes from an earlier paper in 2004. Okay, so that's the background. Katie, if you could move the next slide. Thank you. Now, more recently, just to give you a sense, healthcare itself has obviously changed a lot in 20 years. And we have a lot more care in the home, increasingly more care in the community. We have different expectations of the involvement of patients and families, which has always been a big concern of us. We have different understanding about the kind of actions that might follow these incident analyses, how to develop recommendations, and so on. So this paper sets out a number of changes that were not made to the London Protocol at that time, but how incident analysis has to change for the present day. Longer timeframes, not just the 48 hours in hospital. Sometimes, the problems may have started before the patient came into hospital, maybe other things may have happened, and then there may have been further problems at discharge. We need to think much more across the system. We need to work more with patient families, and I think also particularly not to have a sort of bureaucracy of endless rapid investigations, but to do a few incident investigations much more thoughtfully and seriously. Because once you've done, say, 10 incident investigations in an area, you have a huge agenda and list of ideas for improvement. Next slide, Katie. And this gives you the sense, this is from a book with Rami Alberti, but you just see this, the slices here, instead of having sort of one point of time, if you like, where you look at the errors and the contributory factors, you may have several. So all this thinking is the background to the new version of the London Protocol. Next slide. And this was done by myself. I'm not on the slide, but there's Sally Adams on the left, who wrote the original one. So it's obviously involved in this one too. Tommaso Belandi, Helen, Philippe Michel, and Anthony Staines. And we've released it. Next slide, please. We released it last September. And that's the English version. And there's recently a paper in BMJ Quality and Safety, which explains the background and development in more detail than we're doing today. As in previous editions, the New London Protocol has this, we don't have actually a flow chart, but a series of stages you go through to when you're investigating an incident. So this is not rigid, it's not formulaic, but it doesn't makes life a lot easier to follow this sort of standard process. But it requires reflection, it requires all your clinical understanding, your understanding of the organization to bring to bear, and not just the investigators, but the people concerned. Next slide, please. And we also have, again, the framework of contributory factors. We have the main categories, an extra one for technology, because it's so much more important now. And you can use all these to trigger one's thinking and reflect on the system. And I'm just going to talk about a couple more things that to give you a flavor of the London Protocol before Helen takes over. So some new elements in, we have a lot more in about engagement of patients and families, and particularly about the need to look after people before engaging with investigations. How about we talk about the selection of incidents? I think the need to, in the previous past, we looked more, as many investigators did, at the problems of care, but we now also emphasize you have to also highlight what's the good care that was provided and provide more of a balance. And Helen will talk about some of these other things. I'm just going to an observation of the clinical area as well. So just a couple of bits, just to expand on a couple of these points. I've spent many years, over the years, I've talked to a lot of people who've been harmed by healthcare. And it is, I mean, I used to be a clinical psychologist, so I used to, to talk about distressing events with people anyway. But in healthcare, it's a particularly difficult situation. I think apart from whatever injury is sustained, you have the difficulty that the patients concerned were harmed by people that they trusted. It's not like being, just in a road accident where some idiot runs into you. There's a sense of betrayal there often, which is quite deep-seated and very difficult. It's a bit like being harmed accidentally by a member of our own family. Also, people are having treatment sometimes in the same setting where they originally had these problems. And depending on how organizations respond over time, the harm can be compounded. I used to call it the second trauma, by the way people respond. So emotionally, it's very complex. So although people understand this, and there's now a very serious attempt to engage patients and families, which is all to the good and actually necessary, particularly when care is happening in the home much more. I think it's very important when doing this, not to think about the investigation first, but to think about looking after people first. This sounds very obvious, but it can easily be lost in the, in the procedures and protocols of organizations and the anxieties about whatever's happened and so on. And the continuing duty of care is the thing to emphasize. So often patients and families will say things like, after all this happened, and the things went wrong, we felt abandoned. Instead, at the time when we needed more care, we actually got less. So the primary duty for everybody is, to look after. And this includes the staff, of course, as well. And to do this before worrying too much about involving them in the investigation. We also put in much more, which wasn't in the earlier protocol, about the value, and again, I'll let Helen expand on this, of understanding the situation in people's work. It's so easy to have hindsight bias and to look back at something that happened to think, how could they possibly do that? And then you go down to the clinic or the operating theatre or the community centre, whatever it is, and you actually look and talk and see what the pressures they're under, the way they work, the fact that the working conditions are so difficult, there are far too many patients and things, it sometimes becomes only too clear how errors can occur and the adaptations and the workarounds that people have to make just to function. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Helen in a minute. I'm just going to show one more slide, which is just to say to you that we have versions now in French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and a Spanish version should be produced, I think, by the Doda Median Institute in Barcelona anytime now, but that will be released. So we have that too. So now I'm going to hand over to Helen.
I'm always cognizant when I start speaking about things like safety systems analysis in a room with Charles of the extraordinary amount of work that's gone on behind the scenes, because it felt for me as a clinician that was being asked to do a lot of these investigations, just so incredibly helpful that this thing existed. And I'm going to take you through a bit of the background to this for me and the way I talk about human factors to colleagues in my organisation here in Oxford, a little bit of the personal perspective. And then I want to focus on just a few things because I'm very mindful that it's going to be really good to have time to talk. So I'm going to focus on the challenges I had with interviewing family and staff, the things that worried me. I'm going to speak a little bit about designing recommendations and then a bit about report writing, because as I say, those were the key things. And that's still a constant refrain I get from colleagues who are learning to do this in healthcare generally, about the things that are particularly difficult for them. And I'll touch on the training that we've delivered over the years. And then, as I say, plenty of time to chat. So for a long time in healthcare, we've known about safety issues. And in my own specialty in anaesthesia, I think we can be justifiably proud of the focus we've had on safety. But it really took quite a long time until articles like those that Lucy and Leap and Charles published quite a long time ago now to really highlight what a problem this was. And arguably in the time since then, we've not seen the kind of sustainable, robust change in patient safety that we might have hoped for. And certainly those two books on the right there, so Robert Weir's Still Not Safe, it's quite dystopian. It speaks a lot about the problems of middle management in that very different healthcare system in the United States. But the book by Charles and Renee is free to download. I would strongly advise you to take a look if you're interested. But it really clearly exposes the issues we face in ensuring that these key messages, these core messages on how to improve safety are heard at the necessary levels. And I think the other thing I would say is that, speaking as someone that remains clinically active, I'm fascinated by team resilience. It is fundamentally what keeps healthcare safe. And James Reason said this very much as well. You know, the human in the system is the piece of the system that adapts, responds, flexes, and changes in the moment to ensure that we don't slip off the cliff into a safety incident. And this paper that Dulcie pulled together, you know, with help from the team of us a little while ago, is an absolutely fascinating insight into the kind of strategies that we use in healthcare to adapt to the pressures that we're all facing. And I just recently, if you're interested, another colleague of ours, Jane O'Hara, is developing a series of podcasts, The Stories of Safety. And this one I just listened to as I was gardening at the weekend. And it's Sean Linton speaking about the journalist perspective on safety incidents in healthcare. And if you remember, he was the journalist that broke the mid-staff story. And it's a fascinating insight into the issues that he faced in exposing that story. And currently, he was speaking about his experiences in other organisations in the NHS. And his concern is that fundamentally we are relying too heavily on the resilience of teams to keep healthcare safe. And the kind of signals that he saw in the evolution of mid-staffs, which include things like reducing headcount, are apparent now in healthcare. And we need to be very mindful of this. It's a red flag. When I began this process of getting involved in safety incident investigation, many years ago now, a publication came out from the Select Committee in the British Parliament, looking at the NHS process for investigating incidents, and it was clearly not fit for purpose. And so, as a result of that paper, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch was born in the UK, and it is an independent body tasked with those rather more objective perspectives on safety incidents that we really should be espousing everywhere. And since then, we've had the introduction of the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework, which very much posits the importance of systems-based approaches and recommends the use of the London Protocol. And of course, since then, we've, as a team, collaborated to adapt it and translate it into many different languages. And so I guess the fundamental issue here is that the paradigm shift in thinking about safety within systems that's happened in other high reliability organisations hasn't really yet happened in healthcare. So, you know, I think we're still very much in that domain of thinking, well, the humans are having problems, they're not remembering things, they're not seeing things that they should, they're not aware of issues. And of course, what we should be saying, and what's recognised in these high reliability organisations, is that human error should be seen as a red flag on the system. There's a problem here. You should be looking at the systemic vulnerabilities and fixing them. And of course, when you're investigating, saying what people should have done, it's very satisfying. Oh, well, he should have thought about this. He should have rung so-and-so. He should have recognised that he needed such and such a scan. Of course, that's nonsense and in no way explains why it made sense for clinical individuals or teams to do what they did in that moment. It takes a much deeper exploration to understand that. And of course, when you're designing recommendations, telling people to be more careful, I mean, I'm sure you've had those emails, sometimes from well-being managers, sometimes from less well-meaning managers, that say, you know, I want you lot to be more careful when you're prescribing insulin. You know, we can't be having these safety incidents on Ward B again. Are absolutely unhelpful and never going to fix the problem. It is only by constantly seeking out these systemic vulnerabilities that we're going to reliably improve safety. And so if I wind back now to the time when I was thinking about starting to get involved in safety incident investigations, it was an enormous relief to me to find the London Protocol and, you know, since then to be involved in its evolution. And this is basically what it looked like. And I can remember seeing this figure when, as I say, I'd been asked to investigate this incident, and I'll touch on it in a bit more detail in a minute. And I thought, oh my Lord, where do I begin? And all of a sudden, there's this document that tells me exactly where to begin, exactly how to structure my approach to undertaking this investigation and what I should be thinking about. It was an enormous relief, as I say. So I'm going to start you with a story now, a pretty straightforward story of a patient who needs an antibiotic after surgery. And on this particular occasion, there were no nurses available to give the antibiotic. The patient wasn't known to the doctor that was asked to give the antibiotic, and the drug had been left out for preparation in the treatment room. No particular checks were made. Bear in mind, this is a doctor giving a drug. And the patient developed red man syndrome and unfortunately also had aortic stenosis. That's the AS in the box there, which meant that, you know, there could be more of a problem because he wouldn't necessarily be able to mount a significant response in cardiac output to the fall in blood pressure through giving what you are probably all recognizing is vancomycin. So if I tell you the story like that, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, what on earth was that person doing? What an idiot, not thinking clearly, not planning properly, not doing checks. But when you unpack it and start to understand what's going on, you realize that it's a rather more complex and messy concatenation of contributory factors coming from those domains that Charles touched on a moment ago, things to do with the tools and technology that are available, things to do with teamwork, with fatigue, with organizational pressures, with culture, and so on. Now, the reason I tell this story is that it's mine. This is something that happened to me as a house officer many, many years ago, an intern, at the very beginning of my career. And at the time, I very much thought about it as I first described to you. What an idiot I am. I could have really harmed this patient through my ineptitude, through my not paying attention. And it was very upsetting to me. In fact, the patient was absolutely lovely to me. I cannot tell you the number of times I went back and apologized to him, and he said, it's fine, I'm absolutely fine. I felt a bit funny for a minute, you're all right. But all I could think was, that might not have been the case. And I sometimes think, to Charles's point about the sort of second victim issue that's been so well described by Albert Wu, is, you know, if it hadn't been for the support of the colleagues around me, and certainly if the patient had actually suffered as a consequence of what I did, I might not be a doctor today. I might not have been able to cope with that. And then you think about the cost of training me and all of those sorts of things. What would that have said if it hadn't been, if I hadn't been supported through this? And I hope you can see, you know, the sorts of system issues. There were issues to do with tiredness, and you might be interested that HSSIB has just released its report on the impact of fatigue on safety in healthcare. And I was very tired on this occasion. It was at a time long ago when the culture was that doctors just worked 3 days non-stop. And I'd literally been on from Friday night until Monday morning. It had been super busy. And I felt very odd, very, very tired to the point that I was feeling odd. As I say, I'm sure that resonates with many of you. And I'd been asked by a highly respected senior nurse on the surgical ward to get down and give a time-critical medication. And to be honest, all of us junior doctors were quite frightened of this nurse. She was a wonderful woman, but when she said something, you jolly well went down and did it. And so there was that pressure in my mind. So I'm fatigued, I'm feeling stressed. I've never been taught to give antibiotics. At that stage, medical students were not taught to give antibiotics, and certainly I did not recall in that moment the importance of giving vancomycin slowly. So I gave it like a doctor does, bang, right, off to the next job. That kind of thing is what set me up in this situation to fail, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to fast forward now, many years into the future, when I'd become very interested in how we investigate safety incidents. And we were funded to run a review project around the Thames Valley region where I work. And we engaged with a number of acute care hospitals, and we decided we were going to teach investigators to use the London Protocol and focus in a system-based way on the contributory factors that led to a safety incident occurring. And so I'm going to give you one anonymized story from this project. So a woman in her first pregnancy comes into the labour ward at 28 plus 2 weeks gestation, so obviously preterm, with premature rupture of membranes. That's PROM. So her waters had broken, basically. The history of this pregnancy was complex. She'd had very low mood in the first trimester, so she'd been quite depressed, severe nausea and vomiting, intrauterine growth retardation, IUGR, a group B strep infection was known, and she was presenting in breech. So lots going on in this pregnancy. And the outcome was a very sad premature delivery by emergency section and a neonatal death. Now, I'm going to move on to the comparison of contributory factors that we did. So we asked investigators to give us original reports, and then we provided insights onto these reports as a part of the project. So these are the findings from the initial internal report. And I don't really want you to read too much of it. I just want you to notice how many times the junior midwife is focused on, and also the fact that the only point in this woman's journey that is considered is that last few hours in delivery suite. And now I'm going to show you what we found. So we looked at the whole story, recognised the complexity of the case, looked at what had happened in the antenatal pathway, and there'd been many missed opportunities to recognise the problems that this woman was facing. The lack of clarity in the standard operating procedures for staff in both the antenatal context and in the delivery suite were problematic. It wasn't clear what you were supposed to do. Communication breakdowns didn't help. There was a lack of beds within the system for neonatal care, so the patient was going to have to be transferred. There was a decision to repeat the ultrasound scan at the point at which active signs of labour were being exhibited, and there was no ultrasound available very close to the unit. She had to be transferred. And this was a very junior midwife who was not being supported adequately because of the pressures of work in the unit. Okay, so I hope you're getting a sense of more of the system, they're sort of looking more widely at the system in that second consideration of contributory factors. Now let's look at the recommendations. So in the internal review, we've got a series of suggestions that I find intensely frustrating. And I still see this kind of thing when I'm asked to, to review incidents currently. A lot of, send that team on a course, give a lecture to the midwives about the importance of early recognition of decelerations on the CTG. Ask someone to write a reflective account. I mean, this is bobbins. None of this is going to work to support the evolution of safety in this area. When we looked at this, we thought, right, you've got to start at the beginning. You've got to look at antenatal services. You've got to think about the multidisciplinary pathway. You've got to think about support for staff in the workplace, workforce planning, revision of standard operating procedures, all the things that make it easier for staff to do their job correctly in the moment. And one of the really practical things that we said was, you really need to bring point of care ultrasound to your delivery suite because your radiology department is too far away. Person focus, system focus. We need to be moving much more to the system focus way. So I'm going to touch briefly now on the things that worried me, as I say, when I was first asked to do an incident investigation. And it was a long time ago, and it was a very sad death as a result of a complex airway problem in intensive care. And I was asked to do it because I've been trained in intensive care as an anaesthetist. But the thing that made me anxious was, A, this is hugely complex. It's a very sad story, and it involves a lot of my friends and colleagues. So already, there's a conflict. but this was how it was, right? And you know, I said, and I haven't had any training. And they said to me, well, you've done that root cause analysis half-day session 3 years ago, haven't you? And I said, well, yeah, I have, but you know, I don't think that's really good enough. So anyway, I went trawling around looking for things, and that's when I found the London Protocol. And within the London Protocol, this is the older version. I'm going to show you the new version in a second, but there was a very clear description of how I would undertake an interview with very stressed staff members, very upset family members, and all of these sorts of things. And all the considerations were taken into account. And interestingly, a lot of it, not surprisingly, because it was psychologists that developed the original London Protocol, was based in the peace framework that the police had developed. And this was developed by organizational psychologists. So the current London Protocol looks like this. The infographics a little bit prettier, but it's fundamentally the same thing. You know, you set the scene, you provide a supportive, psychologically safe environment in which to have the conversation. You think about the whole story so that you understand all the bits that you need to look at. You identify care management problems in collaboration with the people that you're talking to. You think about contributory factors together with the people that were involved in the incident. You think about, you know, what's been happening since, are people being supported? And then together you come up with some initial reflections and recommendations. And I found this super helpful and designed my own template based on this particular model. Then the contributory factors are helpful when you're interviewing, and I actually usually have these in a list. It's within my within my interview template. And I use it all the time to remind me, because it's so easy to forget in the moment to ask a specific question, especially when people are upset. And so you might miss something. And what you don't want to do really is go back to someone and say, oh, I'm awfully sorry, I forgot to ask you this. You know, that's another stress. And just to highlight the challenges that we face in healthcare, I still remember an incident I was asked to investigate when a patient had a wrong site craniotomy. Excuse me. And I knew that the scrub nurse was desperately keen to talk to me about what had happened, but we were struggling to find a time when we could get together. And I recognised, one night I was on call and I realised that scrub nurse was in theatre in the West Wing when I was in the John Radcliffe. And I thought, you know what, I just need to contact them and go over and see them. So we found ourselves at 4 o'clock in the morning in a quiet office in the West Wing of this hospital, having the conversation about what had happened, because they needed to get it off their chest. And this was the only way we could do it. So if you talk to me about the challenges we face, that's one of the ones I often highlight. It's time to do this. It's support for your staff in the moment when they're feeling stressed about what's happened. Let me move on to recommendations, because this was another thing I worried about. And of course, the London Protocol very helpfully highlights the way you think about those. So when you're designing recommendations, and this is a lovely paper from Trobovich and Shajania, and basically what it says is, remember, the strongest recommendations are always about system changes. But you've got to be realistic, because some of those system changes will be expensive. One of the system changes I recommended when I investigated the airway emergency was, we need a new intensive care unit. There's not enough space in here to get all the kit in to the side rooms in the moment. Now, you know that's not going to happen, but unless you recommend it, it won't be seen as a problem. And actually, those sorts of recommendations in safety incident reports have fed into business cases in my organisation. So it's not trivial. So even if you know that's not going to happen, I still think it's important to say it. Automation, task simplification, standardization, I could talk to you for hours about that. Those are important interventions. I've got a bit of a problem with education and training being regarded as a weak intervention. It's only weak if it's done in the way that I've just said to you. Send so-and-so on a lecture, get them to do a course. I mean, rubbish. That's not going to work. It's the low dose, high frequency model that works in education anywhere, but particularly, for example, when you're talking about simulation. If you want your staff to embed skills in the management of crises, whatever they are, anaphylaxis, bleeding, whatever it is, you have to do your simulation in bite-sized chunks regularly, the so-called T-trolley simulation. So in the protocol, it provides a sort of framework for thinking about the design of your interventions as well. So this might be what you might be thinking about when you're pulling together an action plan with the right people in the room. So you prioritize your contributory factors, and remember that your contributory factors can exist in more than one category, right? So you might say that fatigue was a problem for the individual, but it's also a problem for the organisation and for working patterns. So it might sit in organisational culture, and it might also sit within your team domain, that the team needs to think more about fatigue and so on. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's going to change the way you design your recommendations. You need to list the actions to address the contributory factors, involve everybody. Think about who's going to be responsible for implementing the actions, think about resource requirements, think about evidence of completion, and importantly, think about what you're going to measure to prove that what you've suggested is actually doing the job. And then, you know, practical things like identifying dates, proper dates, give people targets. Finally, writing the report. Massively important, and something I struggled a bit with until, again, I looked at the framework of the London Protocol and I designed my own, and also actually used the original MPSA. This is the National Patient Safety Authority that used to, it still sort of exists in the UK in a slightly different format, but it had a template that was actually quite good. And in the London Protocol, we've now, in the latest version, adapted that and many other aspects and built our own recommendations for the flow of a report. And this is what we teach. So it gives very clear guidance on how you pull it all together, including guidance on how you describe the chronology and so forth. I'm going to lastly touch on teaching of the London Protocol, and just let you know that the sorts of things that we find really, really helpful are exploring just culture. So Charles' point about, you know, not blaming people. This actually is a super helpful document. Again, funnily enough, designed with James Reason involved many years ago now, but super helpful when you're beginning your investigation and you're showing people that you're not considering blaming them. You want to be absolutely supportive. When we think about the design of recommendations, we often use tools like this as well that fit into what the London Protocol describes. And within the protocol, you'll have seen, you know, that it suggests describing the chronology accurately. And there are many ways that you can do that. And I personally tend to do it in this way, but sometimes I see some people like to actually display it in a more visual, more obviously temporal way. And time person grids can also be helpful. So these are the sorts of things we bring into the teaching to support people in understanding that there are many ways that they can explore different aspects of the incident analysis and then the report writing. So I'm going to finish by bringing it back to the team and just say that, of course, resilience this is where your resilience sits. This is a team, one of the wonderful teams I work with here in Oxford. It's my Max Fax gang. I'm with them on a Tuesday in the West Wing. They're a wonderful group of people, and I promise you I didn't make them smile. This was at the end of the day. We'd had a really good day. We got through all our elective work. We'd added an emergency case as well. Super helpful, super positive day. We felt like we'd done a good job. That's what makes you happy. That's what keeps you going back into work. But of course, as I say, we've got to remember that we cannot rely completely on the resilience of our teams. We've got to be thinking about systems-based approaches. And this is where the London Protocol comes in. And I honestly, you know, there have been points in this journey for me where I felt like I've been banging my head against a brick wall. But actually, I've seen an enormous change in the way the NHS thinks about incident analysis. The quality of doing that it remains variable, and there's work to be done. But the London Protocol is the most widely validated framework. I know I'm biased, but I hope I've convinced you that in my own journey, I found it incredibly helpful. And so I'm going to stop now and ask if any of you have any particular questions.
So this is really good. Thank you. And thank you very much for your comments. I think these are going to be really useful for us. Thank you again, Helen and Charles. And just to reiterate, the slides will be shared with people after the session, and there'll be some links which will be useful for you. Shah, are you going to launch a poll here which helps us to understand the quality of the things we do and helps us, in the spirit of the Q community, improve what we do? So please do answer questions as honestly as you can, and we will get better. But thank you so much for giving the time to come along to this. I hope you found it useful. As we said right at the beginning, we're always looking for new members in the Q community. So come and join us. We do loads of things like this and they're all great. Please come and join us. But thank you so much.